Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to this mini lecture on Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Note that there's actually no "the" there. The title of the book is just Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think he did that intentionally to make the title even more strange, just as the story is, as well as Elaine Showalter's chapter Dr. Jekyll's Closet, which is part of her book Sexual Anarchy. And you read the introduction to that book, which was titled Borderlines, earlier on in the semester. That was the one that talked about like the countdown clock in Paris and the turn of the century and all that. So something that we've talked about in previous classes, in our last class, was how in the 1700s and the 1800s there started to be a much more intense social focus and this new idea of defining people's sexuality in terms of identity. So if you act a certain way, that is fundamentally definitive of who you are as a person in the very core of your being. And the way in which that becomes an almost kind of quasi biological, medical, scientific definition of the self. And that idea is very much key to Elaine Showalter's analysis of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So obviously, this theme of the duality of man, the duality of the human mind, that humans contain both a dark and a light side, or a good and an evil side, that is an eternal theme that we kind of see throughout literature of the world. But what happens in the late 19th century, according to Showalter, is this idea of the duality of man, the duality of the human mind, becomes especially associated with homosexual and heterosexual identity. So the idea that, like, oh, we have two sides, a light and a dark side, gets mapped onto the idea that, like, oh, we have two sides, like a gay and a straight side. And that occurred alongside the birth of this new homosexual identity, which also occurred in the late 19th century. So, something that people had to start grappling with in the late 19th century is that, oh, okay, if we're now going to all start thinking about homosexuality not just as an act that one does or doesn't do, and an act which any human being could potentially be tempted by, into thinking of homosexuality as a core of identity that is part of your physical or psychological makeup from birth onward, such that it's fundamentally definitive of who you are as a person, then how can we explain the fact that homosexuals are not always aware of their identities fully from like day one? How is it that some people can very convincingly present themselves in society to be heterosexual while harboring this kind of deep secret that even they themselves might not be aware of until a certain moment in time? So we get the birth of what we might now call the closet narrative, right? This narrative of coming out of the closet. Uh, I think we very much saw this happening in John Addington Symonds' memoirs, where he was attempting to explain how his psychological and sexual development occurred as this homosexual. So, according to Elaine Showalter, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is an early version of a closet narrative. Obviously, this isn't like literally happening in the book, but it's more of a metaphorical expression of this closet narrative, and it's a gothicized version of the closet narrative. So if we think of Gothic texts, texts that have a really strong supernatural element to them, what's often said about Gothic texts is that they make literal what in other texts would be represented in more kind of realistically psychological terms. So that the events in a novella like Jekyll and Hyde is like a literalization of the psychology of a closeted person, someone who's closeted about their sexuality. So, what I'd like you to discuss on Facebook today, or for your entry for this one, is you can think about parallels and similarities between Jekyll and Hyde and the memoirs of John Addington Symonds, especially if you wanted to compare what Symonds says to Dr. Jekyll's narrative of the case, which is like the last chapter of the book. Or something else you could talk about would be Foucault's description of the new identity of the homosexual in Perverse Implantations. And you can find that in subsection 2 in the part that begins from the 19th century homosexual, and then it ends with the part secret that always gave itself away. And you can compare that description to any of the descriptions given of Hyde and his actions throughout the novella. Or you could think about any of the descriptions of Mr. Utterson, his kind of repression, his kind of weirdness, and especially Mr. Utterson's emphasis on men who keep each other's secrets from being exposed. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed both of these readings and this little mini lecture, and I'm excited to see what you have to say about it on Facebook. Okay, thanks very much.